Clash Royale's Barbarian Hut is a card many people don't talk about nowadays, but it was very unique for its time, being the most expensive building in the entire game at 7 elixir and not really having a definitive purpose. Yet this card has been the cause of many unfun metas in the 7 years it's been in Clash Royale. This card was the exemplar for a reason to never add another card like it. This card has had many changes and reworks over the years, and Supercell still seems to not know exactly what to do with it, thus today remains as having the lowest use rate of any card in both ladder and grand challenges. So in today's video, I'll be discussing the history of this card, the peaks and downfalls of it, the impact that it's had on the game, and how it ended up in the position that it remains in today. Before we get into the history, let me introduce you to Honkai Star Rail, a new free-to-play space fantasy RPG from Reworks, the makers of Genshin Impact. This world combines elements of myth and legend with a space sci-fi story. The protagonist climbs aboard the Astral Express with a group of passengers who claim to have inherited the will of the Trailblaze, where they'll pursue the traits of Erons to explore the reaches of the universe to seek the ultimate answers to the journey's purpose and unearth secrets buried in legend. In this adventure, you'll meet new friends, increase your combat power, and overcome powerful enemies in an immersive RPG experience. This game is very easy to understand and pick up as a new player, yet still has a deep battle system with a high skill ceiling. This game has a unique art style and great characterization. You'll get to explore tons of different worlds, each with a unique style to keep the game fresh as you progress. The game is out right now, so don't wait. Download Honkai Star Rail for free right now. You can find a link to it in the description or the pinned comment. Also use the promo code on the screen to get an extra 50 Stellar Jades. Thank you to Reworks for sponsoring this video. Barbarian Hut is an OG card appearing with the original 42, and arguably there is a portion of these 42 cards that were fundamentally broken from the start due to not really knowing how well which of these mechanics would and wouldn't fit into this type of game, and perhaps the Barbarian Hut would fit into this category of misfits. Barbarian Hut is a spawner building, and at the time there were two other spawners, Tombstone and Goblin Hut. The idea of spawners were pretty simple. You place the building and troops will trickle out in waves, slowly chipping away at the opponent's tower if left alone. This was a cool concept on paper for this type of game, but not great when implemented. Remember how I said spawners were simple? Well, that was the main issue. The opponents place a spawner, and then for a full minute you have to deal with waves of trickling troops. It requires a lot more effort on the defender's part than it does on the person who places it. Spawners didn't really need additional support like other cards might, and the placement was very simple, usually just going between or behind the princess towers. The game was much simpler at this time, and although the January 2016 Barbarian Hut may not have held up in the modern Clash climate, it was still moderately popular in this early environment, but it was the least popular of the three spawners. If you saw a Barbarian Hut at this time, you were pretty much guaranteed to see a Goblin Hut and a Tombstone with it, and it didn't really work out vice versa. Being 7 elixir, it has the disadvantage of lacking versatility compared to the other spawners. You would see a Goblin Hut and Tombstone being used without Barbarian Hut in a variety of different archetypes, but the Barbarian Hut was only used in an archetype that would go on to be one of the most hated archetypes in Clash Royale history, the spawner archetype. An archetype that was simply overwhelming the opponent with waves of troops by constantly placing spawner buildings. However, this archetype is practically dead in 2023 and has been for quite a few years. If a spawner meta arose today, there are plenty of cards that would help to counteract that, but back then the collection was very limited. Cards like Witch and Wizard were the best ways to deal with spawners, but even they weren't perfect and they were quite fragile. Overall though, the Barb Hut was only average at best during this time. About a month into the game's lifespan, Barbarian Hut would make an appearance in the February 2016 balance changes, getting a slight rework. The Barbarian Troop would be getting a health nerf of 4%. This was due to the other card the Barbarian Hut was tied to, the Barbarians, being the second most used troop in the game, appearing in 59% of top ladder decks. The January 2016 Barbarians had so much more health than the modern day Barbarians, having the same HP as a +1 modern day Wizard. To compensate for this health nerf, the Hut would receive a health buff of 10%. This actually marks the point in its history where it had the highest number of hit points it had ever had, nearly 58% more than the Expo. It was certainly very tanky, but you would expect that from a building so expensive. The balance changes caused the Barbarian Hut to fall in usage a little bit, but the game was brand new in the first few months obviously, and the meta was rapidly shifting week to week even when there wasn't balance changes. But throughout February, the Barbarian Hut's usage rate continued to dwindle to around 4% usage and hovered around there for a few months. Going through the rest of 2016, Supercell really never gave the Barbarian Hut any attention. The Barbarians themselves got a few bug fixes, but these changes were applied towards many troops. One trend I also noticed in the leading months was that the Goblin Hut's usage rate was falling while the Barbarian Hut's usage rate remained steady. This seems strange considering for the entire game's history up to this point, the Barbarian Hut was practically unseen without the Goblin Hut, and the Goblin Hut usage rate actually fell to 0% in top ladder play while the Barbarian Hut remained at 4%. The spawner archetype was dwindling in popularity due to the release of the Princess, and players were just getting better at dealing with it. However, the Barbarian Hut found a new place working in some niche Three Musketeer decks utilizing its defensive capabilities, which was especially good against the most popular win condition, Hog Rider. But as the Three Musketeer archetype evolved, the Barbarian Hut was left without a purpose, so by July 2016, the Barbarian Hut saw no usage in top ladder play. It remained at a 0% usage rate until November 2016, where it made a surprising minor comeback. Lava Hound decks with Baby Dragon were falling in popularity due to the release of the overpowered Mega Minion. With Giant and Hog Rider decks becoming more popular as a result of this, Barbarian Hut found its way back into Three Musketeers with a below average but still notable 5% use rate in competitive play. I do want to note that although I made it sound like spotter decks died out within the first couple months of the game, they were still being somewhat commonly used in mid-ladder. It's just hard to cover exactly how popular it was because the only statistics I have are from top ladder. However, the Barbarian Hut's brief time in the spotlight would quickly fall as the meta evolved, and with the release of the Elite Barbarians, fell to consistently hovering around a 0 to 1% usage rate. During most of 2016, it always remained at a 0 to 4% use rate in competitive play, yet never really got a buff or even direct attention. They only messed with it when they had to balance the normal barbarians. But as I stated before, the card did see play in the casual environment and it was quite frustrating to deal with. The biggest hindrance to its potential was its defensive nature. Supercell made it clear early on they wanted to promote offensive gameplay, and thus a lot of defensive cards suffered for it, while cards like Hog Rider were left alone despite being incredibly popular. But was that an excuse to leave a card in a dead spot forever? Apparently Supercell thought so, because throughout the entirety of 2017, the Barbarian Hut or the Barbarians did not receive a single change. Supercell seemed to have no intention on fixing it. Despite even giving the Goblin Hut 2 buffs that year, it wouldn't be until June 2018 where the Barbarian Hut would finally receive a buff. But again, this was just to fix the normal Barbarians. This was a simple hit speed buff to the Barbarians from 1.5 to 1.4 seconds. However, by now there weren't just 2 Barbarian cards, there were 4. And none of them were really good. It didn't seem like a tiny hit speed buff to a card that had a 0 to 1% usage rate for nearly 2 years could make a big difference, but a buff is a buff. The main focus likely wasn't on the Hut anyway. Remember, we're already more than 2 years into the game and the Barbarian Hut has never really been meta up to this point. It was just sort of accepted as being useless, so players didn't bat an eye after this buff, thus the rates stayed similar to what they were before. But the Hut would later be seen to have much more potential than met the eye at the time of the June buff. Although in the leading months of this buff the Barb Hut stagnated, by around October this card's potential was being recognized and utilized. This Fireball bait deck seemingly out of nowhere began to trend. This was a pretty weird deck just because there really wasn't a win condition. Your main damage dealers were Cannon Cart and Flying Machine. It was such a defensive deck that was in a huge part thanks to the Barbarian Hut. The Hut was just a wall that could absorb so much damage. After this deck arose, other variations of Fireball Bait quickly followed, with some of these containing Three Musketeers. You were even starting to see the Barb Hut appear in Graveyard and Royal Giant a bit. The Barbarian Hut was certainly a meta card in late 2018, after being ignored for years thanks to just a 0.1 hit speed buff to the Barbarians. And if you look at the Grand Challenge rates for the Barbarian Hut for this time, it had about a 10% use rate and a 52% win rate, which are pretty healthy stats for a card. It seemed like the card was in a perfect position from a statistical standpoint, but fair and balanced is not how many players saw it. Despite being statistically balanced, the Barbarian Hut was widely seen as a very low skill card, and this card was creeping into several archetypes which made the game less fun for players having to go against it. It drew out matches and wasn't contributing to Clash Royale in a positive way, so when January came along, the Barbarian Hut would finally for the first time in its history get direct attention. The absurd amount of hit points was the biggest contributing factor to the card's strength, and Supercell didn't want to mess with the normal Barbarians, so the easiest move seemed to be nerfing the hit points of the Hut, so that's exactly what they did. It would get a health nerf of 7%, and although it was still a very tanky building, it did see a fall in usage, but it was certainly still viable and still being used in Fireball Bait on a competitive level. But only 2 months later, in an attempt to rework the standard Barbarians card, the troop would get a hit point nerf of 13%, making it die to Fireball. But unlike the first time the Barbarian troop got a health nerf, the Hut would not receive any form of compensative buff. As a result, this already below average card would fall to becoming the least popular card in Grand Challenges, other than the heal spell. Was that really the end for Barbarian Hut? The card was balanced and slightly below average, but neither of those were good enough. If the card was viable, it would be inherently disruptive to the meta. For the rest of 2019, the card would not appear in any more balance changes. The card seemed finished. Almost a full year after its last change, the Barbarian Hut would surprisingly receive a rework. The lifetime of this card would be reduced by 10 seconds with an increase to the spawn speed by 1 second. But the biggest change was now spawning 2 barbarians upon its death. This was a way to make the building more spell resistant and give more consistent value. It was certainly an interesting change, but I really wasn't sure what Supercell expected from it. This change didn't really change the core frustration of this card. If Supercell was willing to nerf it with below average raids, what was the point of trying to get it back in that range or even higher without a total renovation to the card? So how did the Barbarian Hut fare in the meta after this rework? Well, it began appearing once again in the decks that it was appearing in during the last period in which it was viable, having very similar rates to its pre-March 2019 state. It seemed like it was in a decent position, and it was. However, there would be some major developments of the game's meta in the upcoming months that would have a drastic impact on the Barbarian Hut. A big part of this would be thanks to a new archetype that wasn't in the game the last time the Barbarian Hut was viable, the Elixir Golem Battle Healer archetype. Although the Elixir Golem had just been nerfed and the Battle Healer was not doing great, the Barbarian Hut, when teamed up with this duo, was found to be a very powerful synergy, thus raising the use rates of all 3 cards. And if you know anything about the Elixir Golem, it's not exactly considered a skillful card, and teamed with what's considered to be one of the lowest skilled buildings, it didn't exactly result in a positive game experience. The Barbarian Hut actually had one of the highest win rates in the game at this time. The very next month, in April 2020, another major meta shift would occur thanks to 2 major balance changes. The first one is the Heal spell, which would become the Heal Spirit, and this card would be very strong upon its release. And with the successful Barbarian Hut rework, Supercell decided to apply a similar change to the Goblin Hut, now spawning goblins upon death. The Heal Spirit, unfortunately for the community, also fit very well into the Elixir Golem archetype. Now, you might assume this would cause an uptick to the Barbarian Hut since it was also very fitting in the Elixir Golem archetype at the time, but the Elixir Golem archetype actually evolved without the Barbarian Hut. The Goblin Hut was now the spawner of choice for Elixir Golem players, as that card was extremely powerful now. The shift in this meta caused the Barbarian Hut to fall immensely for the April 2020 season. So how does Supercell respond to this fall to the Barbarian Hut? Well, they decided to nerf its hit points again by 20%. Just further proof Supercell will keep spawners down even when they're statistically balanced and not game breaking. And what happened was exactly what you would expect. The Barbarian Hut was right back at the bottom. So 2 times in the Barbarian Hut's history already, it's been below average and they still nerfed it, even after a rework. What could they possibly do now? Well, they didn't do anything, and players just commented that the game was better without spawners being good. However, just the very next month, in June 2020, the Barbarian Hut was beginning to make a comeback, spiking to 5% use rate and a very decent win rate. In fact, it had the 2nd highest win rate in the whole game. 2 major things happened in June, causing the Barbarian Hut to find a place in the competitive environment again, despite having 20% less hit points than before: a bomb tower nerf and the release of the Skeleton Dragons. The Skeleton Dragons were another very strong card upon release. Now, you should know that Elixir Golem was dying out by May with the Barbarian Hut, which is perhaps why they waited until June to give the bomb tower its nerf, since bomb tower was a very popular card to use during Elixir Golem metas. But despite nerfing the 2 huts and the battle healer, the archetype would make a comeback this month. With the Skeleton Dragons as a new great synergy and the bomb tower not being able to keep this archetype in check, Elixir Golem rose in popularity again. And since the Goblin Hut got an even harsher nerf than even the Barbarian Hut in May, the Barb Hut made its way back into the Elixir Golem archetype as the spawner of choice. I don't want to give full credit to the Skeleton Dragons though, because the Baby Dragon variant was also used quite a bit. Throughout 2020 though, Elixir Golem Battle Healer was beginning to phase out with Heal Spirit nerfs, but the Barb Hut only continued to grow in use and win rates, and by September was in 8% of Grand Challenge decks with a very decent win rate. Barb Hut had been popular with Graveyard for a while now, but it was appearing more and more in the Royal Giant archetype now. This Royal Giant Barb Hut deck was trending by September. In October, the Battle Healer even got buffed, which caused this odd Graveyard deck to become vaguely popular. By November, the Hut's Grand Challenge rates were basically the same as it was during its peak from 2018, which was impressive considering the number of hit points it had lost since then. All the balance changes that occurred during 2020 really weren't even attempting to nerf the Barbarian Hut directly or indirectly. It was quite surprising how lenient Supercell was being with this card considering how harsh they had been with it in the past, and every other spawner was performing horrendously compared to it. I was really boggled to see how Supercell had let the Barbarian Hut stay in the meta for 5 straight months. This card had stood the test of time and had remained viable in several different archetypes. Surely Supercell couldn't let this card remain popular forever. In December 2020, Supercell yet again nerfed the Barbarian Hut's hit points, this time by 22%. It would now be fully taken out by a rocket. At this point, it was just uncreative. At least this time, it didn't fully drop to 0%. The card clearly was not good at this time, but it wasn't in the worst position it had ever been in. It wouldn't be until a full year later for this card to appear in the balance changes once again, where the hit points were decreased yet again by 15%. However, on top of that, they would also decrease the lifetime by an additional 10 seconds while decreasing the interval between waves. This was advertised as a rework, but this really seemed like another nerf to me. Obviously, a hit point nerf just makes it an even lousier defense, but with the waves spawning closer together, that just makes it easier for cards like Bowler to take out more waves since they'll just sit on defense longer. This quote-unquote rework surprisingly didn't help the card, as it immediately fell to a 0% usage rate, becoming the least used card in the game yet again. Another 6 months would pass for the Barbarian Hut to receive another change, and once again it would be a Barbarian hit speed buff of 0.1 seconds, but unlike the first time this happened, it wouldn't creep into viability. The low hit points just made the card too weak of a defense to harness the power that it used to. Investing 7 elixir in a building that now had less hit points than a mortar couldn't be made up for by a small hit speed buff. It was just so unclear what Supercell wanted from this card. It felt like it had been in every position a card can be in, and yet Supercell changed it regardless in every case. The history of this card has been insane. Fun fact, it has lost exactly 50% of its hit points since its peak, but up to June 2022, the card had been involved with 11 sets of balance changes. But Supercell wasn't ready to give up yet. Rather than waiting another 6 months or even a full year for another change, Supercell would recognize the card's weakness by September. The season was Barbarian themed, and it was recognized by Supercell themselves as being the least played Barbarian card, hinting at a buff. No, by this point, the Barb Hut had not surpassed a 1% use rate since its drastic nerf from December 2020, nearly 2 years by now. As October 2022 rolled around, the Barbarian Hut would receive one final change that puts the Barbarian Hut in the place that it remains in today. Players were not excited for a potential Barbarian Hut buff, but Supercell was giving it attention anyway. The last change would be yet another rework, but probably the biggest rework it has ever received. For the first time in its history, the elixir cost would be reduced to 6 elixir, and the number of barbarians spawning per wave would be increased from 2 to 3. In return, the lifetime would be decreased by another 10 seconds, now making it half of what it was on release. Each wave would be 4.5 seconds further apart as well. And finally, the number of barbarians that would spawn on its death would be reduced from 2 to 1. However, only 8 barbarians would spawn total if left alone, because 2 full waves would spawn, along with 1 barbarian from a third wave, along with 1 death barbarian. This change was definitely pretty confusing to look at, but this change was finally an attempt to tackle the defensiveness of this card while keeping it viable by drastically increasing its offensive capability and versatility. It saw some initial success in graveyard decks, but after the Phoenix came out, all interest seemed to evaporate, leaving the card to stay at the very bottom yet again. And today it continues to be the least popular card in Grand Challenges, Classic Challenges, Ladder, and even 2v2. It's very rare for a card to be this unpopular in every single game mode for this long, but being such a low skill heavy defense, this is the position Supercell has preferred to keep this controversial building in. It's been 6 months since the last Barbarian Hut change, and I honestly don't know if Supercell will attempt to change it anytime soon. Supercell actually imposed a similar change on the Goblin Hut in the next balance change after the last rework, saying that the Barbarian Hut rework has worked well. So I guess in Supercell's mind, being dead in every game mode is a success. All jokes aside though, I think the last rework was a terrible one. This is not how the Barbarian Hut should be. If this card is going to be balanced, it needs to be reverted to 7 elixir and receive more hit points. After reverting it back closer to its pre-rework state and buffing the hit points, I would then impose a change that has never been attempted before to prevent its reactionary strength, delaying the first wave by just 3 to 4 seconds. This would allow whatever was attacking it to get more damage on on it before those first barbarians could step in to help. This card needs change to get back into the meta. Out of all the states it's been in, I honestly think the modern day Barbarian Hut is the worst out of all of them. When I was looking at the history though, I noticed Barbarian Hut and Goblin Hut changes have almost always happened within a few months of each other. There's also been multiple instances where the Barbarian Hut and the Furnace got attention in the same balance change. So why does this matter? Well, if you pay attention to the most recent balance changes as of this video, you'll know both Furnace and Goblin Hut got reworked and buffed just recently in April 2023. So if history repeats itself, this may indicate a Barbarian Hut change will come in June. But honestly, does Supercell even want this card to be viable? Do we want a balanced Barbarian Hut? It seems like Supercell and the community don't like it whenever this card is in the meta, and being considered one of the lowest skilled and defensive cards in Clash Royale, a perfect balance may not be the ideal scenario here. So maybe the 6 Elixir rework was going in the right direction in that regard. But then again, Supercell won't give the 6 Elixir Barb Hut a real chance to thrive in the meta even after 6 months. So we can't know if a 6 Elixir Barb Hut will be any healthier than a balanced 7 Elixir Barbarian Hut. I do want to see this card reverted to be more similar to how it used to be, even if it's bad, because whatever it is right now doesn't feel right at all. It has no purpose or niche in this game and is way too bad to have fun with even in a casual environment. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this card though. Should Supercell try to rework it or buff it again? Or is it better off being unused and forgotten? I for one am very intrigued thinking about the path Supercell will decide to take this card down. I would also just like to say before I go, I was working on the history of the Miner, but did postpone this project due to the April nerf because I don't like covering cards that have had or are likely to have new development soon. None of the cards I've covered have received balance changes since I covered them, and I like being able to include the full history of every card I cover. I just want to let you guys know that I am aware because he is easily the most requested card I see. If the Miner does not appear in the June balance changes, I will likely finish that video that month. But anyway guys, thank you so much for watching, and have a good one.